The gallery evening had been small by design. Its modesty was its strength. It had required those present to do a small amount of work, to pay attention in a specific way, to accept that a performance might be partial, and to complete it with imagination. The larger offers demanded that I become a spectacle again, that I supply the miracle other voices craved. Felix's column, which had seemed at first like a frivolous irritation, a man filling his evening with speculation, took on a weight when it began to circulate. Emails arrived from corners of my life, colleagues offering solidarity, old acquaintances fishing for a dramatic return, a few curious strangers wanting to know whether the new Matthias could be booked. The moral commerce of art had shifted imperceptibly into the public square. Every response was a claim on my personal loss. I found myself cataloging not only offers but the kinds of audiences they would summon. There was also the matter of the reviews. Some were careful, the kind that attempted to place the gallery performance within a lineage of experimental art, a generous architecture, while others sniffed at sentimentality. One critic called the event an aesthetic band-aid, and I thought, not without shame, of the people in the audience bridging their own emptiness with my fragile phrases. Another review, written by a woman who had no stake in my old reputation, described the evening as exactly the kind of modest, moral experiment our overproduced culture needs, which made me imagine a committee somewhere nodding with approval. That evening, after Marta had left with a little victory, an arrangement of a televised interview, penciled in provisionally Clara, and I sat with Leanie on the floor, knees bent, canvases stacked against the wall like muted witnesses. The flat had the same low light as the gallery's antechamber. The shadows were familiar as old instruments. For a while none of us spoke. I watched Lena's hands. They bore tiny smudges from the paint she had used the previous night. She reached out and tapped my wrist as if to check I was still there. "Why do many people ask?" she said at last, in the simple matter-of-fact way children have for questions that adults complicate. Her voice contained no derivative cynicism and no hunger for approval, only curiosity. "Because they like certainty," Clara said softly. "An audience prefers a tidy story, fall, rise, redemption. It's easier to clap for a story than to listen to an unresolved piece." Leanie considered this. Then, with the small doggedness that had made me trust her, she said, "But the painting made people finish. Isn't that enough?" The smallness of the question unsettled me more than any columnist's speculation. Of course there were those for whom the painting was a prop that disguised failure, that aestheticized the absence of miracle. But there had been people in the room who closed their eyes and filled the gaps themselves. There had been a child in the back row who drew during the performance and later told her mother it had sounded like breakfast. These were not commodities for the press to package. They were private reckonings. The next morning my phone held the evidence of the world outside my flat, messages from promoters, a glossy email inviting me to a televised return, a call from her Baum, who was blunt and short and whose counsel was not sentimental. "You have to be practical, but you must also not become the man who chases applause," he said. I heard in his voice the same stern affection he had always used when lecturing me on phrasing, precise, a little wary, and honest. Sophia, the conservatory student, sent a message asking whether I would give a masterclass. The request was unglamorous and immediate and made me feel like a teacher rather than a spectacle. It occurred to me then with a clarity that felt like a sudden harmonic that the life I desired now was more likely to be found in such small, concrete exchanges than on the distant pedestal Marta sketched. I made my decision after a long evening of silence with Clara, during which the telephone rang twice. Once with Kurt's impatience, and once with an intermediary from a television company, whose language bristled with promise. I told Clara that I would decline the high-profile return, and she closed her eyes for a moment, as if that choice demanded a little private ritual of mourning and celebration combined. "You'll have to explain to Marta," she said, with the mild practicalness of one used to administering first aid to fragile egos. We explained to Marta the next morning. She listened, her face shifting through the calibrated stages a manager's experience renders readable, first surprise, then calculation, then a trace of annoyance. "You're turning down a door that's open," she said simply. "Doors don't always reopen like this." "I know," I said, "but it would close another door at the same time." There was a pause. Marta folded the papers back into their tidy packet. She did not smile, but she did not scold. I think in the end, she believed in the arithmetic of both choices. She had always been a realist of two currencies, reputation and revenue. "Fine," she said, and the word was both concession and, curiously, relief. She promised, work with the plan I outlined, modest recitals, teaching, and carefully curated collaborations that would not turn Lena's canvases into mere backdrops for a resuscitation narrative. Declining Kurt involved a different language. He called me twice that afternoon, each time with the same urgency. "You can't let the moment pass," he argued. "Audiences have short memories. Festivals will want to book someone else. You've been given a window. The window is only valuable if what I give through it is the thing I can still do," I said. "I won't be put under lights to give people what they hope for. I can do smaller rooms, more intimate work. I can teach. I can work with Leni." My voice felt small on the receiver. Kurt's breath on the other end was the sound of commerce. "You're being sentimental," he said at last, and the word was meant to cut. It did not. If anything, it confirmed the rightness of my choice, the decision to pursue work that would ask less of miracle and more of honesty. We did not part in anger. Rather, there was an odd commerce of mutual recognition. He knew what he could sell, and I knew what I could not give. The days that followed were quieter than I had expected. There were interviews short, managed encounters in which I learned how to say the things that made my absence legible, but not exploitative, and there were evenings when students came to my flat and we spoke of phrase and patience. I found, with the ease that comes from practice, that I could teach form even without the chromatic scaffolding I had once used to illustrate it. Her Baum visited and, in a short, severe lecture about humility, reminded me of the older truth, that musicianship was less about a particular faculty than about the work that daily attendance allowed. Leni, for her part, continued to paint. She thought about art school, and the thought frightened her and excited her and made her small face serious in ways that made me feel older than I had a right to be. Her mother, Anja, worried about the steady income that formal training might jeopardize. We spoke about scholarships and workshops, and I found that the practical negotiations required the same sorts of small, precise compromise that making a piece of music required: an acceptance of limitation, and a recognition that working within them could be generous rather than resentful. One afternoon I received an invitation that made the night's choices seem less like an abdication and more like a selection. A small festival in a provincial town, nothing televised, no glitter. A wooden stage and a program of contemporary and classical pieces asked whether I would perform a short set that included the fragment I had written with Lena's canvases. It was the sort of engagement that demanded few lights and much attention. It did not promise headlines. It promised an audience. I accepted. There was a relief in that word, not the triumph a headline could grant, but the pragmatic pleasure of a plan that felt aligned with the work I wished to keep doing. Clara made tea. Marta, a little reluctantly, began to sketch a modest promotion strategy. Kurt, residual annoyance still audible, moved on to another potential act. Felix wrote another column that tried to imagine my decline as an arc. This time he invited a readerly generosity, and it read less like an indictment and more like the puzzled curiosity of someone watching a private grief recompose itself in public. At the end of the chapter of days that followed the gallery, I sat alone at my piano with a small stack of Lena's canvases propped against the music rack. I placed my hands on the keys and did not play the arpeggios I had once used as warm-ups. Instead, I closed my eyes and began to count small beats of silence, listening not for color but for the small, human noises that make up an audience, the rustle of clothing, the subtle breath, the tiny, involuntary sound someone makes when they recognize a phrase. I began to write notes as if they were lines of speech, simple, austere, notations that could be filled by paint or by memory. The ledger of public expectation had shifted. My work now was to fill the smaller, truer accounts of attention. As night fell, Leanie came in with a painting under her arm and put it beside the piano. It was mostly gray, but in a corner there was a small, resolute stroke of apricot. She did not need to tell me what it meant. I pressed the keys gently and found a line that seemed to fit with the color. It was not a comeback, and it did not need to be. It was an acceptance of limitation, of non-recovery, and of the question of how to make music in the presence of absence. There will be listeners who want spectacle. There will be promoters who prefer a headline to a conversation. There will be mornings when Felix's curiosity turns into a sharper thing. But in the small ledger of the days I had chosen, there was also teaching and the quiet work of composition and the raw, human economy of two people, an old man and a child making meaning together. I closed my hand over the keyboard and felt the keys respond. The sound was not colored as it had been, and perhaps never would be again. But in the small, deliberate pauses between phrases, in the space that Linus Apricot had suggested, there was a gravity I could learn to trust. I left the lights on and walked to the window. Vienna at night had the familiar geometry of lamplight and distant traffic, a map I could not translate into color but could read in its modest, honest topography. The world outside was indifferent. Inside, the choices I had made shimmered with consequence. A promoter would call again, and Felix would file another piece, and Marta would look over the calendar with that sharp patience that has kept careers afloat. Tonight, though, there was the small fact of a scheduled festival in a provincial town, and the knowledge that I had refused to be hurried. The hook, if one could call it that, was not the return of color, but the question of endurance. Whether the modest engagements I had chosen could sustain me, and whether the honest, collaborative work with Leanie would keep evolving. There was danger in this path, the danger of financial precarity, of invisibility, of the slow erosion of a name born in brighter lights. There was also possibility, a practice shaped by fewer mirrors and more hands. Music that asked listeners to finish the phrases. Art that was a conversation rather than a coronation. The ledger of the public had been balanced with a private count. I turned back to the piano, and in the small room where Linus Apricot gathered light, I began again. I received the first proper offer on a Tuesday. Marta arrived with a laptop and a brochure that smelled faintly of plastic and ink. She sat at the small table in my flat as if she were tidying a scene, elbows close to her sides, spine composed. The practiced economy of a woman who had spent her life negotiating other people's reputations. Outside the window a tram hissed along the rails and the city air carried, for a moment, a memory of something like normalcy. Leanie had left canvases propped against the bookcase. Her blues pooled and dried into edges that reminded me of chords I no longer heard. "They want a return," Marta said, and the phrase came out as if it hurt to pronounce. She clicked through the slides. Glossy photographs, a sponsor's logo, the pitch, a televised gala, state funding assured if certain conditions were met, an orchestra available. A conductor whose smile had been photogenic in every magazine. Kurtz attached. We could arrange a major hall. The narrative is attractive, Matthias. They want the arc. They want the fall and the return. It's tidy. I watched her hands, which shaped the offer into a rectangle on the screen. I could have told her, then and there, that I was not interested in tidy arcs, perhaps because the truth of my loss felt too crude to be smoothed into plot. But the practical part of me listened: money, visibility, a team that would handle inquiries. I thought of the legal bills lined up like stones at the edge of a stream. I thought of the conservatory's tuition I had once imagined paying for Leanie, the possibility of a year of study that would keep her from precarious market sales. Why would I do that? I asked finally, and the question sounded smaller than the brochure. Marta was not surprised by the bluntness. She had been my manager when I was younger and braver in another register. Because people will watch, she said. Because they will tell a story they can place on a timeline. Because there are grants and donors who will be impressed by spectacle. Because you'll sell recording rights. Because you'll be back where you belong. Back where I belonged is a strange proposition, I said. It assumes I can put the past on a stage and say it has been resolved. Her expression softened. We can shape the story to you. We can make it circumspect. I looked toward the piano, at the closed lid that reflected the lamp's light in a long, thin bar. Lena's canvases behind the sofa looked from different angles like a chorus, their colors answering one another. I remembered the gallery night, the way color and sound had found a tense accommodation, and the post-concert conversations that had been more about what they could sell and copy than about anything that had happened on the floor. The idea of a televised gala felt like an attempt to press my life into a format that would be marketable rather than true. Don't you want to know what you would be asking me to do? I said. Marta hesitated. It's an offer, Matthias. You can reshape it. You can insert the kind of honesty you prize. Her voice assumed the gentle, coaxing tone she used when negotiating with donors who wanted reassurance they would not be embarrassed. You don't have to pretend there's a miracle. You can make it about fragility. Audiences are moved by that. That was the rub. Audiences indeed were moved by fragility. It had been exploited by journalists and blurred into my narrative like running ink, but I had learned, painfully, that public sorrow is a commodity. To allow the cameras back into the spaces of my failure felt dangerous in a way that was not simply professional. It would convert my private reckoning into a consumable feeling. It would make my grief a headline. Give me a week, I said, and Marta packed the laptop as if one could place hesitation into a case. She left with the kind of optimism she reserved for deals that could be adjusted. After she left, I sat at the piano and did not play. Clara arrived some minutes later with a plate and a quiet look that had, over time, become as familiar and as hard to parse as my own reflection. She moved through the flat like someone carefully checking whether the furniture still fit the room. You didn't tell her what you told me last month, she said, setting the plate down without offering to sit. What did I tell you? You said you didn't want spectacle. You said you wanted to think about teaching, about small concerts, about work that didn't insist on miracles. I still mean it. She watched me for a long time. Good, she said finally. Then tell Marta. The week that followed felt like a test of sorts. Offers arrived with the steady, insistent rhythm of a city that feeds on stories. Kurt sent messages that read like advertising copy. Felix sent questions that smelled of hunger. And an intermediary from a foundation asked whether I would at least consider a residency tied to a series of televised conversations. Each proposal asked me to compress complexities into a clear, digestible narrative. Each advised that transparency, just so long as it was framed, would make the audience feel they were witnessing authenticity. I met with Herbaum in the small back garden behind his apartment, a place where the air always seemed to hold a memory of chalk and old paper. He had a single chair, a battered thermos, and 2 pigeons that took the measure of him like old friends. He did not mention Marta or Kurt at first. People think the world can be fixed by a good performance, he said, breaking a piece of bread and letting crumbs fall for the pigeons. They think you will walk back on stage and everything will be settled. But music isn't a plaster, Matthias. It's a practice. It is the stubborn return to a thing, over and over, until you find the work. I thought, for a moment, that he was asking me to submit to some practical penance. His hands were rough and marked at the nails. His voice had the low, gravely quality of someone who had always been closer to instruments than to journalists. What would you do? I asked. He regarded me for a long breath, then reached into his coat and produced a small, worn metronome. It had the sort of chip in its casing that made it, at once, more reliable. He wound it and set it between us. The tick sounded in the small garden patient, indifferent to everything but the passing of time. Teach, he said. Teach poorly at first. Teach with humility. Write small pieces for your students. If you can do that, you'll have a way to go on. Public returns are not your only measure. There was a tenderness in his bluntness that felt like permission. as if he had given me the right to reconfigure my life without apology. I told Clara I would decline Kurt's proposal. She did not look surprised. She had expected as much. "It may be risky," she said, "but the risk is yours to make. If you want to teach, really teach, then set the terms. Don't let anyone tell you the lesson for you." The conversation with Kurt was short and efficient, which suited him. He proposed the existing plan with the urgent confidence of someone selling a season. I declined. I tried to be clear. I thanked him for his energy, for the work he'd put in, for the opportunities he'd arranged in the past. I said I valued the idea of reaching audiences, but that the form he proposed did not fit the work I wanted to do. "You're making a mistake," he said finally in the tone of a man who had seldom been refused. "Perhaps," I said, "but it is my mistake." When I hung up, the phone felt like something heavy in my hand. In its silence, however, there was a small, new freedom. Choosing meant relinquishing not only an income but also the instrument of spectacle. It meant facing practical considerations: rent, bills, the price of canvas for Leni, and doing so without the buffer of a grand narrative that might justify everything. It also meant accepting that my old life, measured by reviews and box office numbers, was not returning in the same form. Sophia arrived 2 days later with a movement she had prepared. She was nervous, as students are when they know how much of themselves they place at another's feet. She played with the careful, studied concentration of someone learning not only to execute notes but to place meaning between them. I listened from the back of the small practice room and felt something move in me that was not exactly music but a recognition. Here was endeavor in miniature, the thing her bomb had named. When she finished, she looked at me for comment. I found a phrase that felt true and small. "Your phrasing here asks a question," I said. "Let it be curious." She nodded as if the instruction had weight. I felt, absurdly, a small pleasure that had nothing to do with praise. It was not the rush of applause, but a quiet that settled like an accord. Lena's choice came in the form of a leaflet folded in the back room of the art supply shop. She found it between tubes of gesso and a stack of sketchbooks, and looked at me with that intense frankness that 8-year-olds possess when they know the world is about to change. "What if I go to school?" she asked, rubbing at a fleck of ultramarine on her thumb. "Will they teach me to be slow? Will they teach me to make the small mistakes?" I hadn't expected to have an answer that would be both useful and honest. The conservatory where I had trained had taught me certain disciplines. Scales until the fingers remembered their geography. Phrasing until it aligned with ideas larger than immediate sensation. But formal education, I knew, could also arrange the world into predictable responses. It could, in other words, risk making her into the kind of artist who measures color according to expectation rather than impulse. "They will teach you tools," I said. "They will show you methods and give you names for things you see. That can help you to see differently. But the danger is real. You must keep your way of attending. School should not take that away. You must promise me you will not let the academy make you smaller." She made a face, a serious, determined dip of the brow that had, through the months, become her signature expression. "I won't let them make me small," she said. "But if I learn the words for things, I can tell people why my blues are like that." The remark struck me as both naive and exact. It acknowledged the exchange that art requires, not a surrender but a translation. I found myself thinking, with a clarity that felt almost alarming, that I wanted to be the sort of teacher who would help preserve Lena's voice, rather than smooth it into conformity. The financial worry persisted. Declining Kurt's offer had immediate consequences. Marta bit her lip and suggested smaller concerts, residencies with modest honoraria, masterclasses with paying students. It was not the same as a gala, but it was honest and manageable. We made a plan that had no grand narrative attached, a circuit of small galleries and conservatory residencies, a series of lessons for young players who might not be spectacular but were earnest. It was architecturally a way of making a life by assembling many small things rather than waiting for one big thing to restore order. There was, of course, criticism. Felix wrote a piece that cast me as a man who had refused an opportunity and therefore chosen to remain obscure. It was the sort of article that assumed cynicism, where there had been complexity. Marta emailed at midnight with a draft response, wanting to frame my declination as principled rather than frightened. Clara sent no reply to either of them. She sat with me and passed me notes that were practical, an introduction to a conservatory for a residency, a contact at a gallery that ran modest, thoughtfully curated shows, the name of a foundation that supported teaching initiatives. It was her balm who gave me, finally, the language I needed. We met again in the little garden. He watched me as I unfolded the plan, a mosaic of small concerts, a commitment to teaching, a part-time residency, and he did not smile, but his gaze was warm. "You will be honest then," he said. "Yes, and you will be industrious." "I will be," I said. "I will practice in different ways. I will compose small pieces. I will work with Leni." "Good," he said. "You will find that small is not the opposite of great. It simply lets you be careful. That is an art too. There is a particular quiet that follows a decision. It is not the cessation of anxiety, but the settling of motion into a new pattern." When I told Leni that she could apply to an art academy with my recommendation, she hugged me the way children hug when the logic of the world bends in their favor, sudden, full, without calculation. Anja watched us with the pragmatic expression of a woman who measured options and the potential of both. "If she goes," Anja said later, when it was just the three of us at the kitchen table, "she must not lose what keeps her work true. That is what will keep her earning, perhaps, or at least keep her doing it with pleasure." I thought of the canvases drying in my flat, and of the small pieces I had begun to write, fragments that took as their score the particular shapes of Lena's washes, rather than the ghost of color in my mind. They were short and spare, intended to be accompaniments rather than pronouncements. The work felt like a domestic architecture, rooms arranged to receive the world rather than to command it. That night, after I had sent a brief note to Kurt, and after Marta had revised the small concert schedule, I sat by the piano and played a piece I'd written that week. It was hardly finished, a repeated figure in the left hand, a simple modal melody above, and pauses that allowed thought to breathe. I put Leni's small panel on the music stand, an ochre wash with a thin slice of crimson, and let my fingers find the shapes it suggested. I did not expect anything miraculous. What came instead was a modest alignment. The movement I had shaped resonated with the color's confident simplicity. It was not recovery, it was company. In the minutes after I stopped playing, the quiet in the room felt inhabited rather than empty. Clara came in with the kettle and watched me fold my hands into my lap. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I've made a choice," I said. "Not the easiest one, perhaps, but the one I can live with." She smiled then, and her smile was not triumphant but conspiratorial, as if we had first become allies in a small, necessary rebellion against spectacle. The hook towards which the week stretched, an invitation from a city gallery to present a series of dialogues between music and painting, arrived as a practical confirmation that my choice might be viable. It was not the gala. It was modest, honest, and required me to do the thing I had most feared and most secretly wanted. To make work that could stand in relation to another medium without being swallowed by it. I slept that night with the feeling of a ledger closed and a new page waiting to be written. The choices I had made would, in time, produce new anxieties. The bills would still fall due, Lena's future would still require negotiation. But for the first time since the lights went out, I felt the looseness of possibility, rather than the weight of an obligation that had been purchased for me by acclaim. And as I lay there, I heard not in color, but in a renewed attentiveness, the small sounds of the building, a kettle clicking, footsteps on the stair, Leni humming to herself in the next room. It was a chorus of ordinary lives doing their work. I thought of her Baum's metronome in the garden, of Marta's polished brochure, of Kurt's florid certainty, of Sophia's shy courage. I thought of the choice itself, a refusal and an acceptance twinfold, each shaping the other. The morning light that came through the window did not restore the world I'd lost. It offered, instead, a clearer ledger, the account I would keep of days and practices and lessons taught. There would be failures, small humiliations and compromises, and unexpected triumphs,